Okay, so good afternoon and welcome to Advancing Research Knowledge and Practice APP 702, the first research module within the Master's portfolio. My name is Rachel Pascoe and I'm the module lead, and joining me this afternoon is
Rona Willington. So I work alongside Rachel, so welcome.
And you will notice from the timetable, which we will have a look at in a minute, that Rona and I basically share the delivery of this module. We also share the marking. Yay!
Lucky us.
Lucky us. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time initially just going through some key components of the DLE and some plans for the session. So I'll just minimise that presentation for the moment. All of you should hopefully have seen the DLE page. If you are registered onto the DLE page and you don't see my little cartoon animals and our circus tent, then you're on the wrong module. So if you've accidentally been enrolled on the module that runs in the summer, you will see a selection of fruit and vegetables, which is my theme for the next module. There's no implicit message in either of those sets of pictures, so it allows me to ensure that you're looking at the right program page or module page. So if you have, as I said, been enrolled on the right module, this is the program page you will see, and there's some essential information on the program page. Obviously announcements, which if there's any changes or there's any problems, I will put through the DLE. I'd just like to say at this point that all messages and all emails and webinar links will be sent through your university email address, the email address that's registered on the DLE. So if you have a Yahoo, Mac, Hotmail, etc. email, just ensure that you've checked your university emails, because that's where I will be sharing the information and that's where I will be posting information to. And if I put an announcement or Rona puts an announcement on the DLE page, that's the email address that will be alerted. And you can very easily, there's some instructions on the website about how you can set up an automatic forwarding process, but just make sure that you check your university email address for this information. Then on the next section is the narrative review of the literature, which is your assignment, with the little file being held by a hand symbol. When we come to submitting the assignment or talking about the assignment in more detail towards the end of the module, I will share a little YouTube clip about how to submit your assignment so that it's absolutely clear. And it's a very simple process. You're simply downloading a file onto the DLE, and it does make it very specific that that needs to be a file that's compatible with a PC. So please don't send me a docx and all sorts of other formatted assignments, because myself and Rona won't be able to open them. So it's perfectly acceptable to submit a PDF or a Word document or Microsoft Word for Mac, completely compatible, but some aren't, and it does give you a list of the ones that aren't on this little YouTube clip. So that's your assignment, and I will be talking about the assignment in a bit of detail during the course of this afternoon. Then your little foghorn there is your module evaluation, and I will invite you to complete your module evaluation when the module is completed in December. It's really important that we get your feedback so that we understand what we need to do to the module in the future. Then we have a set of tiles that have, as you can see, different animals, different pictures on them. And as the sessions happen, there will be presentations, and the recordings of these webinars will be uploaded into the separate tiles. So if we start off by looking at the welcome tile, there's the module information booklet, which goes through what the expectations of the module are and some university guidelines. Please have a look at that at your leisure. I won't open it specifically now because it will take time, because it's obviously not playing the game this afternoon. I'm trying to open this one. The second tile down is the module timetable, which hopefully all of you have had a little look at. I'm trying to open it at the moment, but it doesn't seem to be behaving itself. Okay, it's not going to open, so I'll ignore that then. Hopefully you all know the dates of the sessions that we're going to have. They're basically sort of fortnightly. Off the top of my head, I hope I get the dates right. So that's Tuesday the 26th today. Then we've got Tuesday the 10th of October, which is myself doing an introduction to qualitative research. Then it's Tuesday the 24th of October, which will be Rona doing critical appraisal session. Then there is the session, and I've lost my dates now, in November, first week of November, which will be a session on quantitative research methodologies, which will be myself and Bridie. And then there is a session on the 20-something November, which, again, they're all Tuesday afternoons. They all start at 1 o'clock. That's on research ethics and an introduction to ethics. Then we have a session on the 5th of December. We have a session on data analysis across the different methodologies, which will be myself and Rona. And then on the final session, which is on Tuesday the 12th of December, we will be doing module tutorials and assignment tutorials, which we will organise closer to the time. We can either do those via, again, we'll have a general webinar tutorial at the beginning of that afternoon, and then we might break into groups where we might either Skype or phone calls or so on, whichever works easiest for the student, for you as a group. So that's the module, and then the assignment. There is a little bit of a webinar tutorial there as a web link. There is also webinar support. So if you have any problems accessing, or you lose your sound, or any of those technical issues, or anything problematic, then there's some information there. Then we're going to be going through these two presentations, introduction to the module and then introduction to research, this afternoon. Then as we do the sessions, there will be material will appear. So when I, for example, do the qualitative research session, I will put the information under the little lion and then upload the recording of the webinar afterwards. On the underneath the little crocodile, the additional resources, which is spelt incorrectly, I must change that. It's a bit embarrassing. There are certain tabs to certain really useful sites. One to learning development. For some of you, this might be the first time you've written at level 7. It might be the first time you've written anything for quite some time. You might think you need a little bit of help and support in terms of your academic writing. So please don't hesitate to access learning development. There's enormous sets of resources there, including sessions and written material and all sorts of links. So please do access that. There's also a writing development website, which is called RAS, and you can select level 7 work to look at what level 7 work looks like. You can download part of an assignment and have a look at it. You can also submit part of an assignment for commentary on both of those websites. Then there's the library guides. Some of you may be new to study at Plymouth University. Some of you may have been to an induction programme, some of you may not. For those of you who came to induction or have had some sort of induction process, you've probably had a session with our subject librarians. But for those of you who are learning completely at a distance, The library guides are incredibly useful about accessing material and resources that we have available online. So please do spend some time looking through the library guides. And then the Primo search facility there links you straight to the library, and it gives you some assistance regarding literature searching. So if at any point while I'm talking you don't catch it or you don't understand what I'm saying, please don't hesitate to either put your hand up and I'll come to you for and open your microphone for a question if I can. If not, you could type a question as we go along. So please do ask questions if you have any as we go along. And I'll try to keep an eye on the questions as they're coming through. So that's your DLE site, lots of resources there and lots of information. And yeah, I think that's about it. If there's any questions at the moment about the DLE site. I think they're still alive, Lena. What do you reckon?
I hope so.
We've only been going for 15 minutes. I hope I haven't killed you off yet. So, good. I'm glad to hear it. I've got some alives. Great. Over here in this left-hand corner, there's also the link to the Talis Aspire reading list. It's not an exhaustive list. It's actually quite a short list of research texts. Just some things that I've found useful in the past. Some indicative reading. As you go through your particular subject areas, you'll probably have found research that works, texts that work well for you, but there's some indicative reading on that reading list and you can click links to that. So I think that's everything for the DLE page for the moment. So I think the plan for the first part of this session is to just go through these this list. So there's the plan for the module, which we've discussed. There's the module information handbook, which is, as I highlighted to you, is on the DLE page, and you can have a look at that at your leisure. We've had a discussion of the timetable, and it's there as a Word document, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the assignment, because I know that's always an anxiety. People want to know what they've got to do for the module, and then we'll talk a little bit about support. So the assignment. What this module is going to ask you to do is a narrative review of the literature. The deadline for submission for that is the 29th of January 2018. And the assignment is submitted via the DLE. And as I said, we'll talk the latter part of the module, exactly what I mean by submitted via the DLE if you haven't done that before. It's nothing to worry about. It's actually a lot easier than posting it or anything like that, but we do not submit any hard copies, so it can only be submitted via the electronic means. So we're going to do a narrative review. I suppose before I ask that question, does anybody have any idea what I mean by a narrative review? Anybody got any ideas what I might mean? That's very good, actually. Yes, themes and concepts from a range of sources. Yes, absolutely right. It's our views and analysis of a particular research topic. Is anybody else having problems with sounds? Just having, somebody mentioned that there's a few problems with sound. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, so so if you're having a problem with sound, it might be your end rather than this end. So I will, as I said, this broadcast is recorded, so you can always listen back afterwards if you've missed bits. But we're just talking at the moment what a narrative review might be, and some of you are coming up with excellent suggestions or comments about what a narrative review is. It's about reviewing a particular subject area and what's available in the literature, and looking for themes and concepts across that literature, and making some critical evaluation on the material that you've reviewed. I wouldn't necessarily expect any of you to have undertaken anything like this in the past, so don't worry if it sounds a little bit like a foreign language a bit at the moment. So a narrative review tends to be about a specific subject, and the benefit for this assignment for all of you is that you can pick something that you're interested in. So something that is a focus for your particular personal practice area or clinical speciality. So some of you work in critical care, some of you work in primary care, some of you are surgical care practitioners, we've got neonatal specialists, we've got people who are working in the health genetics field, so we've got an enormous breadth and, of different specialities across the module. And you can pick something that you're particularly interested in, so one particular subject area. And a question I often get asked is, how do I pick the topic? What specific things should I be looking at? And that's a really difficult question for me to answer, because it really, without sounding too glib, it really doesn't matter. Yeah. It's something that's interesting to you. If you find it just mildly puzzling now, you're going to find it really, really boring over Christmas. So please pick something that you are very interested in, because it is something that you could potentially, if you take this forward into your research proposal and then your dissertation, or if you're a specialist practitioner and are going to take it into your substantive professional project, this is something that you could be studying for the next 2 to 3 years. So don't pick something that bores you rigid. Pick something that's of real interest to you, but also of real practical relevance to you. And we talk about a traditional or a narrative review, or we use topics like a critical review. And when you have the session with Rona, I'm looking at her now just to make sure she's nodding, but when you have the session with Rona in, nearly a month's time, she will make it very clear what the difference between a narrative or a critical review are. So it hopefully will become very clear what the difference is. But what we're asking for this particular assignment is a narrative review. So as I've said here, so what is a narrative review? It's a literature review which is objective, thorough, a summary and a critical analysis of the relevant available research and non-research literature. I will be expecting, as I'm sure Rona will, you to be looking at a majority of research literature and making a specific commentary on what research is available in your particular topic area. But there will also be some contextual information which might be non-research literature, such as policy documents, recommendation documents, practice protocols, all sorts of other non-research literature that you might feel is relevant to be included. And the goal of a narrative review is to bring the reader up to date with what is known about a particular topic area. So it forms the basis of something else. And that something else may be a piece of research, it may be a critical review, it may be a systematic review, it may simply be a practice recommendation. But what a narrative review does is it starts the process off. It allows you to find out what is known about a particular subject and a particular subject area. And a good literature review gathers information about a particular subject from many sources. Anything to add on that, Rona?
No, I don't think so at the moment. I do think choosing your subject as being something of interest is very important. Don't be afraid to look outside of just the research papers. I think you need to contextualise it with the policies, etc., especially when it comes to your clinical practice. So don't be afraid to step outside that zone.
So what a literature review does is it contains very few personal biases, and we have to be very careful with language here. It contains few personal biases. It doesn't mean it doesn't contain personal opinion. And again, that's something that we'll be thinking about in terms of what we really mean by personal bias versus personal opinion. It should contain a very clear search strategy and selection process. So we'll be looking at the ability to data search and how you have gone through the different databases and how you filtered out information and how you have come to conclude that this is the information that you want to critique. It should be well structured in terms of flow. It should be accurate when using terminology, and jargon should be kept to a minimum. A literature review, a good literature narrative review, should have the ability to be picked up by any professional and read and used as a piece of informative information. So if you have included too much specific abbreviations or jargon that is only known to your particular practice area, you might need to think carefully about how you've used it. And referencing should be accurate throughout.
And up to date.
And up to date. There is no excuse, really, in this day and age, not to reference correctly. There are so many mechanisms by which you can ensure that you are referencing correctly. If you are a IT person, you might decide to use a piece of referencing software such as EndNote. If you are not, and you want to type them out by hand,
like I do,
like Rona does, there's still no excuse for not getting it right. Now, I use EndNote in all of my work, and I think it's like having a magic pixie sprinkling perfection over my pieces of writing. Obviously, I'm not on any kind of commission for EndNote, but I do think if you are starting a process now that might last for 3 years, and it might end with a substantive piece of work, whether it be a dissertation or a project, that actually starting an EndNote library is a really useful tool. Yes, there is a library guide using EndNote. EndNote Online is available free to Plymouth University students. If you want to use EndNote and it is supported by the university, then please don't hesitate to access the information on your library guides. And I think it's brilliant. But there will be a few of you that think, no, I can't bear the thought of using that kind of technology. I don't like to relinquish control. I want to type them out properly. Well, that's fine, but just make sure you do, because it's a serious point of annoyance that at level 7, if you can't reference properly. So I'm going to get off my high horse there, and I'm going to stop going on about it. But please, yeah, referencing is really important. Up-to-date references. Somebody's asked a question about whether they should be the last 10 years. And I'm going to be particularly vague here, which might be a little bit irritating. It's a yes-no answer to that. I would say that in certain topics, anything older than 10 years is now out of date. If you were looking at something to do with the management of a critical care condition, for example, anything older than maybe 4 years, 6 years might be out of date. But in other particular areas, if you're looking at some sort of sociological approach, you might want to go back to some seminal pieces of work that are 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years old. Some seminal pieces of work were written 100 years ago. So I'm never ever going to say it must be 10 years old or less. What I am going to say is if you have used a piece of work that is 20 years old, 30 years old, you need to give me a supporting rationale for its inclusion. So that's a yes/no answer. Do you want to add anything to that?
No, I don't disagree with that, but I would say in some cases, just check that there aren't more, particularly with regards to methodologies and things like that. There are some really good pieces out there and some good texts, but there are up-to-date versions of them, so don't use the older ones. Make sure you have got the latest edition of everything.
Yeah, so certainly when you're looking at books, and I've had a conversation with somebody about a book by McCormack that was published, I think one version was published in 2000. Yes, it's a great book. It's perfectly adequate for reference, but actually there is a 2009 version and there is, I think, a 2015 version. So if you're quoting it or using it as a reference in your assignment, then you should be using the most up-to-date version.
I was thinking of Paraview as well, because there's Paraview 2006, but there is also a 2014, so we should be using the 2014.
Okay, so referencing. Okay, so types of literature review. So we've talked a little bit about a traditional or a narrative review. This is the type that reviews, critiques and summarises a body of literature, draws a conclusion about a particular topic in question. And this type of review is useful at gathering together volumes of literature on a specific subject area, which can be summarised and synthesised. The purpose, as we've said, is to provide the reader with a comprehensive background for understanding current knowledge and highlighting the significance for new research. And as we go through our assignment guidelines, we will look at how the concluding part of your assignment should be making recommendations for a further inquiry, whether it be through a piece of audit, a piece of a project work, or maybe a piece of research. It should identify gaps and inconsistencies in the body of knowledge, and it should help to define a research question or hypothesis. And it can also be helpful in developing conceptual or theoretical frameworks. So it has quite a broad purpose. And the process for a narrative review is selecting your review topic. And I would suggest over the next week or so is to start thinking very carefully, if you haven't already got an idea, to start thinking about what topic you would like to choose for this assignment. Do some preliminary searching, do some primo searching, see what's written. Make the parameters of your primo search quite specific and see what's available. Then make them broader and see what else is available. See what people are writing about in your professional journals. You've all got, I'm sure, a professional journal that you might access online, that you are familiar with. See what's being written about. See what's the current buzz issue in your particular clinical environment. See if that's something that might interest you, but find a topic. Not always, but what sometimes worries me is we get through the module and we're into December and somebody says to me then, oh, I've just thought, should I do this topic or that topic? This is quite a considerable piece of work, and although it's only, I say only, 3,000 words, the preparation and the preliminary work that goes into this piece of work is quite broad, and I can't emphasise enough how important it is to start reading around your topic. When I read the introductions of these assignments, I can tell pretty much instantly whether the person who's written this assignment is well read and informed and knowledgeable about their particular topic area. So start reading, start thinking about, start making some notes about what your subject area is. And that might be quite a time-consuming process. So please do start it sooner rather than later. Obviously, then we go into searching the literature, and Rona's going to cover a little bit about search strategies.
Yes, I can do that.
If that's required. If you're all perfectly happy with search strategies and how to formulate a search strategy, then she won't need to, but that might be something that you could let us know in the next few weeks, whether it's something that you need or whether it's something that we could put an online.
I could cover it quite briefly anyway, though, couldn't I? So it is in that last piece of it. It's in keywords and search strategies.
So search strategy is quite important because you can waste. Yeah, so a few people have said I would appreciate some search information. You can waste a lot of time searching the literature and not finding anything, or not finding anything appropriate, and not finding anything useful. And it is a skill, searching using Primo. So use the Primo link on the DLE site and start thinking about what search terms you're going to use and how you're going to search the literature. So yeah, we're having a few requests.
I'm happy to do that, no problem.
And obviously, if you're coming across some specific problems in the interim, in the fortnight's gaps, then please don't hesitate to email myself or Rona. And I will put our email addresses up on the DLE to make sure they're very clear. Because if you get stuck, then it's often helpful to have a specific question addressed and not wait for a fortnight. So start searching the literature, and you're gathering, you're reading, and you're analysing. That's one step, but actually that's the most time-consuming. That can take months. It certainly can take considerable hours. So do set aside some specific time for gathering and reading and analysing the literature that you come across, because then I've leapt straight into stage 4, which is writing the review, and that's the very last thing you're doing. And then you're obviously referencing it. So step 2 and 3 are possibly a bit more of a cyclical process, as you're gathering and reading and then researching, gathering and reading a bit more and then researching, and that process can take quite a considerable amount of time. When we get to the 12th of December and the last actual taught day of the module, I often say to students, stop now. Because that cycle can carry on and carry on and carry on, and there has to be a point where you go, okay, I'm going to stop now and I'm going to move forward with the writing and the formulating of the review, because otherwise you can carry on going and going and going.
You have to have the confidence to say that's enough.
Yeah, and that's quite difficult. I don't doubt. So at that point, any questions? One thing I will do is, I don't know if I can do this without, I'm just going to close the screen a minute. So you've probably gone to a blank screen, don't worry. I'm just trying to find a document without. I'm giving away everything. I haven't muted the microphone though, Rona. And this is where technology isn't always our friend. You can't open OneDrive and have something else open at the same time for some reason. So any questions? Okay, so just to recap on the assignment, what I've done here, and this template is on the DLE, is I've actually broken it down into even more specific sections in the fact that I've given an indication here of exactly how many marks are given to each section. So we've got the introduction, which outlines your chosen subject and the aim of your search and your search strategy, which is given 5 marks. Search strategy, describe your search terms, inclusion and exclusion criteria, databases, and discussion of how you chose your review content, giving you 10 marks. Then we move into the actual narrative review, which says critically analyse your research papers, concentrating on their strengths and weaknesses in the development of narrative themes. There will be a comprehensive analysis of the research methodologies. So we're going to talk about research methodologies in a moment, but that's 60 marks. So that's very much the bulk of the assignment, and it's about dividing it up into narrative themes. What I do not want, absolutely categorically do not want, is Jones et al. Said this, Smith et al. Said that, and a one-by-one procession of the articles that you have reviewed. That is not the intention of a narrative review. So,
and not purely description.
Yeah, and this is a level 7 piece of work, so you're not just simply outlining what they said and how they went about doing a piece of research. You're giving me a critical synthesis of what they've done and critical synthesis of the research methodologies. We then move into 15 marks for recommendations and applications, and this is where you're giving me an overall, giving us an overall appraisal of the literature. How strong is this body of knowledge? How important is it in terms of your practice field? And how does it influence practice and research, both locally and nationally? And then for 10 marks, a conclusion. So drawing together a legitimate conclusion, which leads to a research question or statement. And yes, this document will be on Moodle if it isn't already. So I will add that.
I was just going to add something. Just when you go through that framework, please don't forget any of the sections, because I know previously people have forgotten to tie it up with a question at the end, and it's really important that you do so.
It's really important that you end with the purpose of it, so that legitimate conclusion at the end. So what's left to find out? What have I highlighted is the hole in this body of knowledge? It's a really important part of a narrative review. Okay, number of research articles. That's another question that's often asked, and if not asked every time I run a module of this type. Again, in the same way as I said date, and I wasn't going to answer that question, I'm not going to answer how many references you need. And the reason, or how many articles you need to review, because it is so topic specific. If you are doing a review on a very specific type of genetic counselling, for example, then there may only be 7, 8 pieces of research, but there may be an immense amount of background. And so your review might actually only review those 8 articles. And that is a completely legitimate number. You might think, oh my goodness, how can I write 3,000 words on 8 articles? Well, it might be possible because it might be a very, very specific field. If you are reviewing the literature around infection control in the emergency department, on the other hand, and you come up with 8 articles, it will be weak, because the amount of research that has been done around infection control in the secondary care setting there's thousands, and so that would be too few. So just as I wouldn't answer the date question, I won't answer the number question, because it is so dependent on the topic that you choose. And myself and Rona, when reading these assignments, are going to be able to see very, very quickly whether the search strategy has been adequate. And that's where that section of the assignment is so important, because if you have done an appropriate search strategy, then you will have given us an indication of the depth and breadth of your reading, and that's really important.
Agree. And on that subject of numbers, the same applies to your reference list. There is no set number for your reference list either, but you need to just evidence and substantiate any claims you make.
And you will need, not only will obviously your reference list include the articles that you're reviewing and any policy and background literature that you might be citing in your introduction, but it will also include research literature. So literature that supports and substantiates some of the claims that you're making about the research methodologies. And so all of these references will be included in your reference list. So again, people have a formula, don't know that if it's 3,000 words, there ought to be 30 references. I'm not making that assumption at all. Again, and it's a phrase that you'll probably get a little bit tired of me hearing, this is level 7 work, and I'm not going to be that prescriptive. But I will be able to tell, as I'm sure Rona will, if you haven't got enough there.
Absolutely.
Any other questions? Is there an acceptable way to structure your work? Yes, there is, and there are examples going to go on the DLE. I'm just going to wait for some permissions from students to put them on the DLE of pieces of work that have been done in the past that can give you an indication of what we are aiming for. In a narrative review of this type, it's perfectly acceptable to have subheadings. So if you want to put headings such as introduction, background, search strategy, narrative review, theme 1, theme 2, give them names, that's absolutely acceptable for a piece of work like this. If you look at narrative reviews that are published in journals, of which I will put one up in the additional resources, an example of a narrative review, then you will see that you know they have a formula which has a very, very clear structure, and I would expect you to follow that structure. And in fact, the template that I've just shown you regarding the assignment and how the marks are handed out is a pretty good structure to aim for. Any other questions? Have I answered all the questions that have been written up? Everybody okay so far? No, they're coming. Sometimes there's a bit of a time delay. So all clear as custard, as my daughter would say. Good. Okay. So so just as a little incidental, as we're at a little break, is there, how many of you, this is the first time you've ever webinared? It's not a verb, is it, to webinar? Hands up this is their first time. Oh. Wow, okay, so pretty much all of you, this is your first time. Okay, I'm not going to make any comment. How are you finding it so far? Okay. A bit weird, yes. Yeah, it is. It is a new and different way of learning. It's a new and different way of having information delivered. You can do it from the comfort of your own home for some of you. Hopefully all of you have found appropriate places to hear and view it, but it is a very different way of learning. We'll get better at it, I'm sure. Don't hesitate to type in questions. It's as interactive as we make it, so please don't, stop typing in questions, because it's really important that you ask questions. Yeah, multitasking is quite difficult. I find it quite difficult to read questions and answer them at the same time. So if you hear me go, I might stop occasionally and say, I'm going to read a question now. But yes, it's all about multitasking.
We're good at it, aren't we?
We are good at it, yes. Some of us better than others, I think. You haven't done many webinars, have you, Wayne, so far?
No. I've only actually run one, but I've been doing before.
So yeah, I'm getting okay at it, I think. Some of the problems are obviously broadband speed and so on. So we've had a look at the module, we've had a look at the assignment, we've had a look at the DLE page. So that's a sort of the introductory bit. So any questions so far, because then we're going to move on to sort of getting really started and stuck into research and research methodology. So any questions so far? Okay, so inclusion and exclusion criteria for research is quite a difficult question to answer. So I would expect there to be research articles that you are critically evaluating. So, and we're going to talk in a minute about what is research and research methodologies, and cover a little bit of information about that. But in all of your topic areas, I would expect there to be some literature reviews and some systematic reviews. They are incredibly useful to read them. You may not do a full critique of a literature review, because a literature review is simply what we've said, somebody else's opinion on the literature. So I find it always very useful to read a literature review, but actually it's secondary sourcing their reference list is more valuable than actually using that literature review. Remember, a literature review is that author's opinion of the research. So as a master's student, I would expect you to go back to the research itself, so the primary source, find it in their reference list and read the original. Because I'm sure we've all been in the situation where somebody's told us about a movie, for example, we've been to see it and gone, well, I don't agree with what they said about it. We've looked at the review of a play, been to see that play, and disagreed completely with the review. So when you're reading a literature review, you're reading somebody's opinion. So go to the original and see what you think. You might have a completely different interpretation of that piece of information for all sorts of ontological and epistemological reasons, and we'll come to what those words mean in a minute. But everybody has a completely different lens that they look at information through. So if you're looking at a piece of information through a lens of a specialist practitioner, you might have a different opinion to that of an academic, for example. So literature reviews are useful pieces of reading. They are very informative and they can be very helpful at helping you frame your literature review, but I'd always be a bit wary of critiquing them.
Yes, I agree. And I think talking about that as secondary research, we have to bring in things like subjectivity and then reflexivity as well, which I'm sure we'll talk about in the coming weeks.
So yeah, it's definitely a good idea to read literature reviews, but I would suggest that it's not ideal to use them as part of your narrative reviews. Any other questions? Okay, well, at that point, if there's no questions, I'm just going to mute the mic for a moment, and we're going to start the second presentation in a moment, but it's just your opportunity to have a comfort break if you need one, or get another cup of coffee if you need one, or so on, but we'll just be probably 3 or 4 minutes before we restart. Okay. Okay, well, welcome back. That was a quick couple of minutes. So you've had a bit of time to think, a bit of time to maybe percolate some of the information given. So please don't hesitate to ask any questions if you need to. But otherwise, we're going to start with our sort of part 2 presentation. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about research now, which is a topic I love talking about. But I understand completely that for some of you, I might say the word research, and some of you might go into sort of a feeling of slight anxiety. And I do understand that completely. So to start with, let's just think to ourselves, if we were going to score ourselves on research knowledge from sort of 1 to 10, 1 being I can spell it, and 10 being professor of research in an academic institution, where do you think we'd score ourselves today? Okay, so well, I've got some really quite good numbers there. I'd just say at this point that I'd probably score myself a 6 or a 7. So I'm not sure. That I'd score myself a 10. But we've got quite a range here. We've got a range from I can spell it to sort of in the lower part of the numbers, and that's absolutely fine. But for all of you, it's an important part of your work, and it's an important part of your development, and it's an important part of clinical practice wherever you work now. So it's really, really important to think about it. And for those of you who are on very specific clinical programs like surgical care practitioners and the advanced critical care practitioners, and I think we've got a couple of neonatal nurse practitioners as well. Hands up, who's neonatal? Yep, lovely. So we've got some neonatal nurse practitioners. I know we've got some ACCPs, and I know we've got some surgical care practitioners. So we've also got other specialities. We've got primary care, we've got cardiology, we've got health genetics, all sorts of different areas. But I think you could all, in your different areas of clinical practice, identify how significant research is on a daily basis and how important understanding and synthesizing research is on a daily basis. And at this level, it's really important that we understand a little bit more than just your basic qualitative and quantitative research. So what I aim to do for the second part of this afternoon, sorry, I'll just answer that question. Yes, I can certainly put a DLE forum up on the DLE page for you to interact with each other on. I can put a chat room up, and you can certainly engage and converse with each other, which will be an excellent idea. So yes, I will put a forum up at the end of today, and you can access that. Maybe I'll have a look at it, and if there's any specific questions on the forum, I can answer them, and then you can all see the answers instead of just an individual email process. So no, that's an excellent idea. Thank you very much. So what do I intend to do this afternoon? We're going to have a little bit of a look at the research process. So for some of you who scored yourselves 6, 7 or 8, this will be complete revision. For those of you who scored yourselves in the 2s and the 3s, this might be some slightly new information, and hopefully we'll all be sort of at the same level by the end of the afternoon. So we're going to talk about the research process itself, and we're also going to talk about differing research paradigms and how those different paradigms influence the way we think. So does that sound okay? Is there anything else that anybody would particularly like? No, that sounds fine. Okay, so What am I talking about when I talk about research? What's research for? We all talk about evidence-based practice, and we all talk about research-based practice. I'm sure we all do in terms of our particular jobs and careers. We have to be very specific about what we understand by the term evidence and the term research. Just to answer a question that's come through about statistics, we've got a session, and I can't remember off the top of my head what date it is, that looks at data analysis, and we will be talking about statistics in that session. Briefly, I'm not going to be going into a huge amount of detail about statistics. We're going to be talking about them broadly and what some descriptive statistics can do and how they can help us and how understanding them can help us. But I'm not going to teach you how to do statistics. So hopefully that answers your question. So going back to what's evidence-based practice, what's research-based practice, hopefully we can all identify what's the difference between evidence and the difference between research. Maybe I should ask that question differently. Can everybody, or does everybody know the difference between evidence and research? Is there a difference between evidence and research? Okay, we've come up with some interesting discussions there. So, evidence can be pretty much could be considered to be any written material that is available that could influence practice or could inform practice, not necessarily influence it. So evidence can be pretty much anything written or verbalized or produced. Evidence can be a protocol. Evidence could be a policy statement. Evidence could be a piece of commentary. Evidence could be a statement. Custom and practice, that could be considered evidence, whereas research is something that's gone through a very specific process of undertaking a research question, collecting data, analysing that data, and then making some conclusions on that analysis. So research is a very specific process that can inform practice, or can give a definitive answer to a question, or can prove or disprove a particular research question, depending on what paradigm we're coming from. But evidence is something far broader. So we have to be a little bit careful when we talk about evidence-based practice, because what are we talking about when we talk about evidence? Now, evidence could be a recommendation from the National Institute of Health and Clinical Excellence, but unless that evidence has been based on research, is it robust evidence? So we should actually be talking about research-based practice, not evidence-based practice. So often we use the statement evidence-based or research-informed. There is an enormous collection of evidence out there. There are specific pieces of research. So research is a far more defined process. Evidence is far broader. So when I'm talking about research, I'm talking about something very specific. If I'm talking about evidence, I'm talking about something quite considerably broader. So research can be defined as the conscientious, explicit and judicious use of the best evidence. So we might be using research to inform what we're doing out in practice. We might be using it to give us that evidence to make decisions about patient care. But it's not necessarily the same thing. So how do we achieve evidence-based practice or research-informed practice? We ask a question. We find the best evidence so that when you are looking at, for example, your narrative review, I want you to look at evidence, but I also want you to look at research. I need you to look at research. It is the research that I want you to focus on. In your introduction to your particular assignment, you might talk about a broad scheme of evidence, as I said, practice protocols and so on. But then I want you to hone it down onto the particular research that you have found around your particular topic area. So if the articles that you are reading and collecting for your narrative review are not research, then you need to dig a little bit deeper, because we need to ask the right question, we need to find the best evidence, and I should possibly add there, and research, critically appraise the best evidence and research, act on the best evidence and research, and then appraise our performance. So it's a process that needs to be undertaken, and the research process is very specific. So I'm going to ask a research question. So I'm just going to address one of the questions that's come in. Yes, of course, you can have very, very poor evidence and you can have very, very poor research. And this is where you might, you will be able to critique and evaluate the research that you are and the evidence that you are looking at in your particular topic area. Because you might find that there is a brevity of sound research in your particular subject area. And the research might be poor for all sorts of different reasons. And it's unpicking those methodological questions will be what I'm asking you to do for your assignment. There is never a perfect piece of research. Every piece of research has flaws. However robust it seems, it has flaws. But if we're looking at the research process, we're looking at asking a research question. So you're asking a question or making a statement about practice. This is sort of what I want you to do in terms of your topic selection. So what's going on? What's the status quo? What particular issue have you selected, and what questions are you going to ask? So we search the literature, review the literature. Any good piece of research will have looked at what else has been done around that subject area previously. Then we prepare a research proposal. So a piece of research should always have a very specific piece of preparation undertaken so that it's done properly. And then we undertake the research. And research always includes collecting data of some description, sampling, analysing that data, and then reporting and disseminating those findings. So any piece of research or any piece of data, any article that you look at and you're trying to identify whether it's research should have all of those key components to it. It should have a literature review, it should have some sort of research proposal statement, so research aim, it should have a data collection phase, some sort of discussion about sampling, a data analysis stage, and then some conclusions drawn from it. It's quite an old definition now, from MacLeod, Clark and Hockey. It's 2001, so it's outside our 10 years, but I still think it's just as relevant today as it was 16 years ago. So a definition of research here is an attempt to increase the sum of what is known, usually referred to as the body of knowledge, by the discovery of new facts or relationship through a process of systematic scientific inquiry. Have you got anything that you pick up on in that definition that you think's unusual or you think's significant? If you look at that quote, is there anything there that you think is interesting? That's an interesting phrase. It assumes no bias. Yeah, it does make the assumption that there is no bias. And what particular phrase or particular word suggests that there will be no bias? Any particular word or phrase? Systematic scientific. Yeah. That phrase is particularly interesting to me, is the phrase systematic scientific inquiry. If it was me and I was giving you a definition and it was my definition, I'd drop the word scientific, because I think that makes a suggestion of an experiment, but that could be implied. But the process of systematic inquiry, I think, is really a really important point to make. So you're absolutely right, and it does make the assumption of very little bias, but it does clearly identify that research is something that needs to be systematic, and there needs to be some level of inquiry, so some level of data collection and interpretation and analysis is absolutely vital. Even older here is Clamp, 1994, describes research in nursing specifically as a link between practice, education and theory, thereby making it essential for all nurses to become knowledgeable doers or research doers. So that's from 1994. And if you think about where we are now in 2017, do you think that that is what's happening in nurse education, or do you think that's what's happening in nursing now? I know you're not all nurses in this group, but some people are saying a categorical no. So substantiate that no with a why. What do you mean by that? Why not? So we've got a few no's. I don't think we're knowledgeable doers or research doers. I'm a nurse by background, so okay. Well, we've got some disagreement here. We've got a little bit. Some people say that we are. Okay, some very interesting points. Yes, I absolutely agree. It is up to us as individuals to read and inform our practice. I think the phrase knowledgeable doer, it was I don't know if any of you are aware, and I might be speaking to the converted here, that in 1994, nurse education, and I apologise to the non-nurses in the audience, nurse education moved into university, And in 1990, we had Project 2000, and then we had a real shift in what was expected in terms of nurse training and nurse education. So this idea that there was a tripartite link between theory, practice and education. And so I think if we look at that definition from CLAMP, it gives us a really, really interesting insight into the socio-political environment of the time, that nurses, as the NMC, well, it was the UKCC at that point, just about to become the NMC, were talking about us becoming knowledgeable doers, and that we were all meant to be research-informed and evidence-informed practitioners. I think it's been a slow development. I think some of you are absolutely right. There was very little research taught in undergraduate nursing programmes prior to the 2000s. Those of you who trained or were educated after that, that probably wasn't the case. There probably was a lot of research taught. Those of the non-nurses amongst the audience, would you think you are knowledgeable doers or research doers? So some would, but not all the non-nurses have answered. So yeah, absolutely. So we work in changing environments. And so I think if we weren't research informed and we weren't research doers, we would be delivering poor practice. We would be not delivering the best up-to-date care. So it's really, really very important that we are knowledgeable about research and informed about what research is and what research can offer us. So it's, and also, yeah, making an interesting point about working within your competence and confidence, and researching a particular topic area might be really, really very important, so that we could we can develop and become knowledgeable practitioners. I'm not, there's a, oh, not even sorry, I'm not sure I understand what that means. I might need to write the rest of the sentence, sorry. Okay, so we now are pretty sure about what we understand by research and evidence, and I'm going to primarily focus on research. So there's a list there that comes from Cormac's book, actually, 2009, and what the purpose of research is, and I think we can all agree that it's about developing professional standards and ensuring that we are delivering the best quality of care. An interesting purpose is there is to establish scientifically defensible reasons for nursing activity. It's a bit worrying. And to earn and defend a professional status for nursing. Again, you might think those statements are slightly controversial, but when we're talking, I'm going to talk primarily now about different research and research paradigms, and I'm going to talk about research methodologies. So I think, well, I'm making an assumption here, and correct me if I'm wrong, that we've all heard the term quantitative research and qualitative research. Am I right in making that assumption? Good. Okay. I should have probably done it with a show of hands. Yes, some people have put their hands up, which is great. So yes, we're all clear that we understand what is meant by qualitative, or we've certainly heard the term qualitative research and quantitative research. So in research terminologies, we talk about paradigms. So a paradigm is a perspective, a viewpoint that can be adopted. So we talk about quantitative research and we talk about qualitative research. We talk about quantitative research, we might refer to it as the positivist view. And we might talk about qualitative research as a humanistic or an interpretive view. So two different paradigms, perspective, viewpoints on the research and the research area. So in these two different types of research, we've got the deductive, we've got the quantitative research, which is on the left-hand side of the screen. And this is where we're going to be testing a hypothesis, a very specific type of research methodology, quantitative research. Or, sorry, we might be looking at an inductive principle, where we will be not testing anything, not establishing proof of a particular hypothesis. We will simply be seeking to advance theory. And that's a very specific difference and a very, very clear and distinct difference in perspective. So if we're talking about quantitative research, we might be talking about numbers. And the reason I've put it in inverted commas is people get sort of, not fixated, it's probably the wrong word, but they get preoccupied with that assumption that there has to be a number, there has to be a statistic, there has to be a particular measure. And that's not always the case. So there may be numbers. But more importantly, a quantitative piece of research is about cause. And it's seeking to explain something, and it's taking a very objective stance to that explanation. Where a qualitative research, again, I've put it in inverted commas, words, because it's not always just about words and language, but it's seeking to understand something. It might be looking for reasons, so it might be looking for a background or an explanation, but it's more about seeking understanding, and it can take a slightly more subjective view. So there's a level of subjectivity. So two differing perspectives, two differing viewpoints. When we talk about research, we tend to talk about fundamental, we talk about theoretical foundations. And there's fundamental differences to the way a positivist and a humanist view certain aspects. So we talk about ontology, epistemology, methodology and method. Ontology and epistemology are really important. It's really, really vital that you start thinking about what is your personal ontology and epistemology, and that is when it's going to very, very profoundly influence your opinion of what you read. So getting to grips, for want of a better expression, with your own ontology and epistemology is quite important when we start reading research. So hands up who's heard those terms before, ontology and epistemology. Good. So a proportion of you have heard those terms before. Just going to spend a little time thinking about those different perspectives. So what's my ontology? If I am an interpretive researcher or looking at a particular issue from an interpretive perspective, I have the opinion, or I have the thought, that reality is mentally and socially constructed. It's culturally based, and that multiple realities and multiple interpretations exist. So if I'm looking at a particular problem or a particular scenario, I might be perfectly accepting in my ontology that there is no right or wrong answer, that there are lots of different versions. And those lots of different versions of the facts will be, or I won't use the word facts, lots of different versions of the issue mentally and socially constructed. So dependent on how I feel or how I think or how I've been brought up or what my culture is will vary, and therefore my opinion of reality will vary. Whereas if I am a positivist thinker, I have an objective viewpoint, that I have my opinion of reality is completely independent of perception. And that's where I'm looking for facts. It's driven by natural law. So if I'm looking at something from a positivist perspective, then I'm looking for a right or a wrong answer, a yes, no, facts, black and white. Now, if I am personally a positivist thinker, when I look at a particular problem, I look at a particular issue, I might see a black and white answer to that particular issue. If I am an interpretive thinker, I might not have that clear category or clear definition. Equally, if I'm reading a piece of research that claims to be positivist, and I am a positivist, it might sit quite well with me. It might it might match my thinking. But if I am an interpretive thinker and I read a piece of positivist research, I might not have that settled feeling about it. And this is why it is so important when starting this master's journey, and some of you are partially through your master's journey, is to actually sit and have a bit of a think about whether you think you are a positivist or an interpretive thinker. Because it'll influence the questions that you ask, it will influence your opinion on the research that you read, and it will influence the way that you write. And that's absolutely fine, because we all, and if you hadn't already worked it out, I'm quite an interpretive thinker. I look at things in a humanistic view, from a humanistic viewpoint. So I'm perfectly accepting of the fact that there are going to be different ways of thinking. And then I suppose on a positive note for you as students on my module, there is no right or wrong answer to me. And those of you who've asked questions like, how many references do I need? What's my data? How old does my data have to be? It's 10 years. Those sort of questions that have come through. My view is that you, who's asked those questions, are quite a positivist thinker, because you like that kind of framework, that kind of firm foundation to your thinking. Now, I'm a humanist, so I'm perfectly accepting with multiple realities. It's a little bit unsettling sometimes, because it means that there is no black or white, but it also equally means that there's a degree of flexibility in my thinking. Any thoughts on that? Yes, it will absolutely influence the way you read research. Can you be from both camps? I would say that you can't be from both camps, actually. I would say that there are many pieces of research that use and utilise both viewpoints, and you will read research that has elements of quantitative research and elements of qualitative research. So they've done some sort of statistical analysis or some data mining exercise, and then they've unpicked that data and done some in-depth analysis or in-depth inquiry, and then therefore utilise both perspectives in one piece of research. But I would suggest that even with both of those pieces of both of those different methodologies utilised in one piece of research, you personally will look at them in one particular way. Yes, absolutely. There might be an element of a situational variation. So in certain period, certain activities, you're very structured, you're very systematic, you're very black and white, but in other areas you think that you have a degree of flexibility in your thinking. So you can alter, but I think in essence you tend to come from one camp or the other. Yeah, it is important to be flexible in your thinking, absolutely. We are working, predominantly all of us are working with human beings, and human beings don't follow scientific patterns. They form patterns, but as we all know, patients don't do what we think they're going to do. They all behave in very varied and different ways. And so even if we take a very positivist view of a recovery from a particular type of surgery, for example, we might have very clear measured parameters of success, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's a black-white answer. So we always have to be a little bit flexible in our thinking. But I think in terms of ontology and epistemology, I think we come from one, we're either a structured thinker or we are a more humanistic thinker. Well, you can have a narrative review that is very positivist because you're looking for themes across your particular research investigation. And so if for example, and we'll go back to a very simplistic example, if you're looking at infection control across a particular clinical environment, and a lot of the research that you're looking at is very randomized control trials and experiments and audits and so on, and those are the research, that's the research that's been written up, you can still look at a narrative across those pieces of research. So tie in how those pieces of research are similar, what themes exist, how are their conflicts, how are their differences, how are those differences built together, how are those differences pinpointed. So you can still be very much a positivist and write a narrative review. You don't need to identify your viewpoint in your assignment. I think it's important for you to think about this personally, because it's important for you to unpick how you view information and how you view the research that you're reading. But I would pretty much bank on the fact that I could guess what perspective you came from when I read your assignments and when I mark your assignments. And Rona's, in case you hadn't noticed, has left us for this section, but I think she would agree that I can pick out a positivist from a mile away. And just because I'm not a positivist doesn't mean I have a negative view of what a positivist thinks and how a positivist thinks. So don't think that's the lesser viewpoint at all. But I think it's a really interesting thing to do, is to actually think about how you view knowledge and how you view information and what you do with that information once you've got it. So that's your ontology. And your epistemology is what stance you take to the knowledge that you've got. So an interpretive would say that knowledge is constructed in a social and historical context, that findings represent the creation of a process between the researcher and the researchee, and that truth is based on pragmatic criteria. whereas a positivist will align themselves with the belief that truth is fact and that they take an objective and detached stance to information and knowledge. So when you are looking at your research, you might think to yourself, what is this researcher's ontology? What is this research or research team's ontology and epistemology? An interpretive will very much think that the relationship between the researcher and the researchee is just as important as the information collected itself. And I particularly like that phrase that knowledge is historical and socially constructed, because as an interpretive thinker, I do very much believe that there are things that we know now that we didn't know, and that the facts that we have and the information that we have now very much is influenced by the historical and social context in which we exist. I've got a colleague who comes from a critical care background, and his commentary to me is that there are no new facts. We already know everything, we're just re-establishing facts now. Some of you may agree with that statement. Some of you may not. So when we're undertaking particular types of research, or when we're looking at research that we're reading, we've looked at their ontology, we've looked at their epistemology, and then we need to look at their methodology, and they need to match. A sound, robust piece of research needs to have a clear indication of ontology, a clear indication of epistemology, and then a clear description of their methodology. So an interpretive methodology would be hermeneutic, it would be a dialectic, and it would be about focusing on uncovering a variety of constructions. Whereas a positivist research methodology will be experimental, it will be controlled, and it will be engaged in testing a hypothesis, for example. Yes, absolutely. Technology means that we do need to develop more knowledge. We don't. I think it's slightly blinkered to think that we know everything already. But that's where a positivist thinker would differ from an interpretive thinker. Any questions so far? Okay, so hermeneutic and dialectic, it's about language, it's about words. What do they mean? What do they mean in the context that they're delivered? What do they establish about the environment that they're in? An example of that would be if you were interviewing somebody and you just transcribed the written word, would that be enough for you to understand what somebody thought about something? And the answer to that would be no, it wouldn't be. You'd have to put context with it. You'd have to put constructions about how that language exists and how it exists in the world. So, for example, if I asked a student nurse about how they were feeling, and the response was, "I am fine," the written word would not give me enough information about that sentence, would it? Because they could say those words in multiple different ways. They could say, "I am fine." They could say, "I am fine," with a big smile on their face and looking absolutely joyous. Equally, they could look quite surly and angry, cross their arms and go, "I'm fine," and use the words in a very aggressive way. So exactly the same language, exactly the same dialect, but it's not got context. So without the context, you don't adequately understand it. So if you looked at a piece of research that had interviewed a group of practitioners, a group of patients, and there wasn't context, then that wouldn't adequately explain. So arms crossed could be a construction, yes, but it's more about their body language. So they could simply have their arms crossed because that was a comfortable way to sit, but without seeing the context in which their arms were crossed. Was it because they were feeling defensive and angry? Was that visual of them standing in front of you, their demeanour, the way they used the words, that combination of information gave me a real insight into how they were feeling. So if I was trying to establish, so all of our new student nurses started last week. If I did an interview with all of the new, which hundreds of them, so I wouldn't, but if I did and I interviewed them all, would I be able to, if I did it by phone or I sent them a questionnaire, would I get the same information as if I interviewed them face to face? No, I wouldn't, because there would be different information that I would get dependent on my method of data collection and my methodology. So if my methodology was about seeking to understand how they felt about being new students in Plymouth University this week, and I simply sent them a questionnaire, I wouldn't be able to adequately answer my research question. I'd have to interview them and I'd have to get context. Does that answer your questions? But if I'm a positivist thinker, none of that is useful information. None of that is relevant because I'm not seeking to explore or understand how they feel. I want to know whether they've done X, Y, and Z. So if my research question was, after the first week of university programme, what percentage of students had undertaken the library induction, I could collect that information from an objective stance. I could develop a hypothesis to prove that 90% of students undertake the library evaluation in the first week. And then I might need some more information and correlate that with the success of their first assignment or something. But that's a completely different research question to the how do they feel about being first year students. Do you see the difference? Two different, completely different paradigms, two completely different questions, still looking at inquiries about first month Plymouth University nursing students. So I've talked about my ontology, I've talked about my epistemology, I've talked about my methodology, and then my method is going to be influenced by what evidence I need to collect about that different research question. So if, going back to my example, if my research question is about finding out about how many have undertaken the library induction, I can collect that through an audit, through some sort of audit questionnaire. If I want to see how they feel, then I need to interview them. Because it's about understanding that your method needs to sit with your methodology, needs to sit with your epistemology, needs to sit with your ontology, and it needs to be clear and explicit. So when you're reading research in the next few weeks, think to yourself, what's the ontology here? What's the epistemology? They've said they're using qualitative methodology. Have they done that? Have they done what they said they were going to do, and have they done it well? If they are positivist and they're saying that they're using a randomized control trial, have they really? Have they done what they said they were going to do, and have they done it appropriately? And does that methodology and method sit well with the research aim that they've stated they're going to undertake? So if my research aim was to get a comprehensive understanding of student nurses' first weeks in university by doing an audit of library inductions, would that answer my research question? And the answer to that would be no, it wouldn't. So you need to look at and see whether the research aim and objective has been adequately met by the methodology and the method that they've undertaken and the analysis. And these things all need to match. And if you come to the second research module and then the dissertation, or the second research module and the substantive project, those things, when you're developing your own, are going to be very important. But equally, at this stage, when you're reading other people's, it's really important that you understand these principles. Any questions at that point? Okay, so we've talked about research paradigms, and we've identified that when we're looking at our research paradigms, we will find qualitative and quantitative research. So we're going to talk a little bit more now about the different paradigms. So as I said, with qualitative research, so with the humanistic research, you are looking to answer questions like to explore, to examine, to investigate. Just before I go on, I just do I think yes, I do. I absolutely do think your viewpoint influences your inclusion of research, because the kind of question that you will ask yourself about practice will be influenced by your own ontology and epistemology. Now, and what I mean by that is, if you are constantly annoyed by the fact that X happens, and why don't people do this particular activity, or why don't patients behave in this particular way, you might then ask yourself, if that's your topic that you're interested in, you will ask a qualitative question about that issue, or a quantitative, dependent on what your ontology and epistemology is. Because if you think in a particular way, you're going to ask a question in a particular way. And so, yes, I think it will influence your inclusion of research. And as you are answering that question yourself in your own head, you are seeking confirmation when you are data searching. It might mean that you miss some vital pieces of research, which is why it is so important for you to acknowledge your thinking. So, for example, if you constantly think about, why do people behave in that way? I want to understand, I want to explain, I'm going down this qualitative route. Okay, I'm clearly looking at it from an interpretive perspective. Maybe I need to look at it from the other perspective. Maybe I need to come at it from a positivist. I'm not a positivist, I don't think that way, but I need to look at the positivist research that might be available. That might help you get a really good understanding of the particular topic that you've chosen. Equally, it might confirm that the questions that you're asking are the more appropriate questions for you. So it is important that you acknowledge how that influence occurs and make sure that you get a nice rounded opinion of the research out there. I don't think it will mean that you'll miss a vital piece of information if you give yourself some time to think about what your ontology and epistemology is, if that makes sense. Does that help? I think if you don't do that bit of navel gazing, for want of a better expression, then you could be a bit blinkered, because you could think to yourself, okay, that's the only way of thinking. Right. I'm a positivist thinker, so that's the only way to think, so therefore that's the only research I'm going to look at. I had I had a lovely moment with one of my advanced critical care practitioners, who is an unbelievably positivist thinker. And it's been a running joke between him and I throughout his programme. Actually use the expression, oh, I possibly ought to have a look and see why people do that, and really try and unpick, get an understanding of why X happens. And I went, oh my goodness me, an interpretive thought. So it's really important that if you are a positivist, you look at the other side of the coin, and if you are an interpretive, you look at the positivist side of the coin. I'm as I said, an interpretive researcher. That all of the research I've done throughout my career is interpretive, but I see the value and I see the importance of looking at the positivist perspective. It's absolutely vital. So qualitative research seeks to explore, examine, investigate. And we tend to use sort of different sort of families of research designs in qualitative research. I talk about families because it's like these are quite broad umbrella terms to research, and they include multiple different perspectives. So it's like thinking about these research designs are very much the surname. We've then got a family of first names to go through. So we might look at ethnographic research, and a lot of research in healthcare has elements of ethnography. We might look at phenomenological research, and again, there's a lot of healthcare research that has an element of phenomenology in it. We might look at grounded theory, which has a very specific research design to it, which again has a very cyclical and reflexivity aspect to it. Or we might look at action research, and again in healthcare these different research designs are quite prevalent. Just jumped forward a bit. So ethnographic research. Ethnographic research is much more about understanding human behaviour in the cultural and social context in which it takes place. So why do groups of professionals behave in a certain way? Why do groups of patients behave in a certain way? Its background is very much in anthropology, so it's looking at human behaviour. And often the methods we will employ when we're looking at ethnographic research are going to be observation, participant or non-participant observation, or we might seek to do some interviews. So if there's an element of ethnography, if you're reading research studies and they've done some observation, they've done some observational work, or they've done some field work, then there is an element of ethnographic research design to that study. Phenomenological research is another broad umbrella term that looks at giving meaning to a particular experience from the respondent's perspective, so how they perceive the world. We often talk about narrative and narratives, and that's not to be confused with a narrative literature review. So this is where I didn't say it at the beginning. Research terminology is quite complex sometimes to get your head around, but it's really important that you understand the differences. So they might look at the narrative in phenomenological research, and therefore it might include, its method of data collection will include an interview. And what I mean by a narrative is that patient story. And we might gain an insight into that narrative through a number of means. We might look at reflective diaries, we might look at case studies, we might look at narratives in terms of a dialogue, i.e. an interview. So those narratives can come from multiple sources. But really understanding and unpicking the meaning of a particular experience from the respondent's perspective. Grounded theory shares with ethnography and phenomenology because it's the study of phenomena from the viewpoint of the respondent, but unlike ethnography and phenomenology, it's about forming theory as we go along. So we are constantly creating theory. So in grounded theory, you will see examples of something called constant comparative methods and constant comparative analysis. So it's very much a cyclical process. So we'll collect some data, analyse some data, collect some more data, analyse that data, and so on. And it's a rolling process. So we might use interviews, we might use questionnaires, we might use observation, but it's a constantly evolving process. Action research is often used in terms of a qualitative paradigm in health service research because it's about problem solving. So we do tend to engage in it quite readily in terms of our research methodologies. It's a reflective process and it's looking at that sort of progressive problem solving. So we tend to isolate what the problem is and then work to solving it or addressing it in some way. And so and those of you who've done any kind of leadership and management or leadership and innovation programs in your careers, either as part of your masters or part of your clinical jobs, will recognise some of these terminologies where you've got an input plan, so you gather data, so it's what we call unfreezing. Then we have the transformative stage where we might act, might do something, so it's changing behaviour, changing something, and then we have an output phase, which is about results, and it's about changing behaviour and gathering data and measuring that change. So we talk about unfreezing, changing, and then refreezing. So those of you who use management speak, leadership and management processes talk about sort of change management as well. Might use a process of action research. So that's very, very briefly some discussion about qualitative research methodologies. We're going to talk about qualitative research methodologies in much more detail in a fortnight's time. So at that point, any questions? Do these resonate with you a little bit? Are you familiar with some of these terminologies? Okay, so we've got some varied response. Some of you are quite familiar with these terms, have heard them before, so either heard them and have some knowledge of them or simply have just heard them. Other ones are, some of this material is completely new, so it might involve some reading. Some of you have saying that you've read some research before and they've never mentioned any of them. That's not uncommon, but it doesn't mean that you shouldn't be able to identify them when you're reading the research. When you are looking at a piece of what you perceive to be qualitative research, and they have interviewed a group of people about how they feel about their diagnosis of breast cancer, for example, you can unpick that and think, right, well, there's elements of phenomenology here. This is an insight into how somebody feels about their particular patient story or their particular journey. So it's really important that you understand what philosophical background that research has come from. Yes, it is very philosophical. it is really important at this level to go dig a little bit deeper than just what's written on the page, to actually unpick sort of what's behind the background behind it. So most of you are saying that you've heard them before. That might be a moment to just go back and revisit some of the work that you've done previously on leadership management, or looking at some of the material that you may have done on research, and just unpicking that understanding again. I don't think any postgraduate student gets to grips with ontology and epistemology in the first instance. It's something to think very carefully about, have a bit of reading time. There's some really easy texts. I say easy, they're easy for me. But they weren't easy for me when I first read them. There are some texts on the reading lists. Rona mentioned Parahu. That's on Keda Parahu's book, is on the reading list, as is Pollitt and Hungler, as is Pollitt and Beck. Cormac's been mentioned already. These are all foundation research texts, and they will have a chapter on ontology, epistemology, and it will be worth spending some time having a look at those and unpicking them. If you do a Primo search, just a preliminary Primo search, and put in ontology and epistemology, you'll get some interesting articles by people like Steve Wainwright, who's written quite a lot about ontology and epistemology in nursing. And so do have a look and start that reading process. But it's a slight philosophical shift. You have to think about it in a little bit more depth now. But this is just a brief overview, and we will go into a lot more detail when we talk again in a fortnight on qualitative research methodology. Whereas quantitative research methodology, this is where we're coming from the other perspective, the positivist perspective. We're asking very, very different questions now. We're asking how much, how many, how often, what percentage, what proportion. We might look at risk factors. So you're asking a completely different question. We might use research designs which are experimental. I've used the phrase here quasi-experimental, and also we might use some sort of intervention evaluation. An experimental design is when we're actually doing an experiment. It's quite difficult to do an experiment on real people because, as you can quite clearly imagine, it might be unethical or impractical. So in healthcare research and in any kind of humanistic research, we do tend to talk about quasi-experimental. And quasi is Latin for false, because it isn't quite an experiment, but it is as close as we can to an experiment in the real world. Or we might do some sort of intervention evaluation. An experimental research is about a test. It's a quantitative process in which an idea or a concept is tested using this positivist philosophy. So empirical data is used to explain and increase knowledge about a particular phenomena. So it might be about a particular illness, or it might be about childbirth. It can be quite nebulous, or it can be quite specific. Positivist research tends to be a little bit more specific. The key factors here is that there is a manipulation. Something happens, we do something to a group of people. So we might give a particular drug to a group of people. We might deliver a particular teaching package to a very specific group of people. So there's control of this intervention. And there's control of the intervention, not of the individual. A comparison group of participants drawn from the same population is also identified. So if I want to do something to a group of nurses, I need to have one group and I need to have a control group. So they're the same as the experimental group, but they do not receive the intervention. So one group of nurses get this particular teaching package and one group of nurses do not get this particular teaching package. And there's randomization. So I allocate participants to each of the groups completely by chance. And this is to ensure that I have a broad sampling of all the different types of people in each of the groups. So if I wanted to do an intervention evaluation or an experiment on a group of nurses, I might get 50 nurses. I need 25 in one group, 25 in the other, and I'll randomly allocate them. So I might use a computer to do it. I might literally randomly give them numbers 1, 2, 1, 2, and half of them go into group 1 and half of them go into group 2. Now, there's all sorts of issues around how do I make it truly random? How do I ensure that I've got the right number of men in one group, as the same number of men in one group as I have in the other, same number of age spectrum between one group and another. So there's often some manipulation to our randomization, but truly random group allocation if we were undertaking the study in the lab. So it would be computerized, for example. Now, hopefully, when you look at those key factors, you think to yourself, this idea of manipulation, where it's the introduction of an intervention to a specific group and the other group do not get it. Now, hopefully, you're thinking to yourself, okay, well, that's all fair and great, but is it ethical? And this is where most randomized control trials that we'll see in practice aren't truly randomized control trials, because there is never a not getting anything group, because that would be unethical. So often we are doing a comparison. So we're giving this particular drug to this group of people and we're giving this drug and something else to this group of people, or we're giving this drug to this group of people and we're giving a new drug to this group of people. But there isn't a third group that aren't getting any treatment at all, because that would be unethical. So sometimes we have to play with you have that issue with lots of different trials that you can't not treat a group. So you're absolutely right, and that's a specific example in Bristol. But yeah, you can't not treat. So I'm sure all of you are familiar with the term an RCT, or a randomized control trial. And these are where random allocation of the participants between the experimental and the control group. The experimental group receives the treatment or the intervention, or a placebo, and that's where we're now introducing additional complexities. If we're doing a drug trial, I'm sure all of you are familiar with different drug trials where one group receives a new drug, one group receives the old drug, and one group might receive a placebo. And then we've got elements of randomized groups, and we compare the outcomes of each of the groups. And we look at the probability of one group having success over another group, or better symptom management, or whatever the test that we're trying to identify is. And the advantages of this, of course, are that we are minimizing bias, and we are trying to control all confounding variables. I'm sure you can all identify that there are problems there, that this can be problematic. It increases the probability that an observed difference between the group is better than another. So you want an increased probability. So you want the probability of, let's say we were testing a painkiller that's against a traditional painkiller. So we're testing drug A against traditional paracetamol, we want to see that the probability of the patients being pain-free is greater in the drug A group than there is in just the paracetamol group. So we've controlled the variability of the intervention, enabling the researcher to clarify that the direction of cause and effect, i.e. that it is drug A, the new drug, that is causing the improved pain management, not the fact that they're in a research study, that they're getting a new drug, that they know they're getting a new drug, because that might have additional positive effects. But it is, and we have to ensure that it is the drug and the drug alone that is causing the positive effect. And only experiments in research design that can, in principle, demonstrate causal effect. So that if I wanted to say that drug A is a better painkiller than paracetamol, I would have to establish that clear cause and effect link. The disadvantages, of course, with a randomized controlled trial is it's really difficult to design an experiment that is representative of the whole specific population. So if I was trying to sample nurses, for example, how could I possibly get a sample that was representative of all nurses? It's difficult to exclude all confounding variables. So if I was trying to test a particular intervention, was it another cause that was causing this change? So going back to my example about drug A, was it the fact that everybody that had drug A was given it in a nicer room? Or they knew they were getting a new innovative drug treatment, so they had a positive effect from it. Confounding variables are always very, very difficult to manage. And if there are too many variables, so if there are too many outside things that could influence the cause and effect, can we actually categorically say that it is this drug that's better, it is this treatment that is better? In a natural setting, this isn't always possible. If you were trying to test whether a particular drug was better than another particular drug, without putting all of your sample in lab conditions, it's not always, it's that natural world and all the different things that influence the natural setting might have an influence on what the outcomes will be. It says there, healthcare settings are not conducive to experimental designs. Patients are not little white rats in labs, are they? So we talk about quasi-experiments. And I would challenge all of you to think of an article, find an article in the next few weeks, and I bet you all can find an article which says it's a randomized controlled trial, but when you actually unpick it, it isn't. It is actually a quasi-experimental design, or it is a intervention evaluation design, or it is not actually a randomized controlled trial. Very few studies are truly randomized controlled trials. But we have this positivist mentality where if we call it a randomized controlled trial, therefore it has a perception of quality. I'm sure you've heard the phrase that the randomized controlled trial is the gold standard research methodology. I'm sure you've all heard that phrase. I would challenge you to find a true randomized controlled trial undertaken in healthcare. They are out there, but they are few and far between. I think if we unpick a lot of them that say they're randomized controlled trials, they are actually quasi-experiments. And the reason is that, certain variables are completely outside the research control. They're completely outside the control of any human being, especially in research, not just because of ethical issues, but just because of human factors. And people who volunteer to be in a trial aren't always truly indicative of the population as a whole. I'm sure we could identify people that put themselves forward for certain types of studies aren't necessarily the kind of people that you want to hear from. We always say this when we look at module evaluations. People evaluate modules, they either want to say something really, really nice, or they want to say something really, really horrible, but everybody that was just absolutely fine and everything ticked along quite nicely don't say anything at all. So when I come to nag you about your module evaluations at the end of the module, that will be why, because I need everybody to answer the questions, not just the people who have really positive things to say and the people who have really negative things to say, because I want the whole population to be sampled. So when we look at RCTs, we have to think about things like the Hawthorne effect. So that whole idea that you're being researched, therefore you're special, and that might make you feel better. The Hawthorne effect can also be very evident in observational studies, in ethnographic studies, for example. So there was a really interesting study on hand washing in a surgical ward at King's College Hospital in London, where two wards were observed over a period of 3 weeks, and it was written up a couple of years ago. It's quite old now, and it's the absolute perfect example of how the Hawthorne effect was very evident. So one ward were told that they were having their hand washing evaluated over the next 2 weeks, and their hand washing technique was absolutely perfect. It was spot on. For 2 weeks, it was absolutely perfect. The other ward was told that general infection control practices were being monitored, and their hand washing was, well, not always perfect, but their infection control protocols were quite well adhered to. But all of those nurses on Ward 1, where they were told their hand washing was being monitored, they knew they were being watched, so they adapted their behaviour. They didn't behave like they normally would behave. They knew they were being watched, and I'm sure you can all imagine that if somebody said to you, I'm going to watch how you wash your hands, you're going to wash your hands perfectly. And so their behaviour changed because they were being watched. So that wasn't a really true indication of the behaviours on that ward. The effect of pre-testing during pilots and experimenter expectations. So the idea that they've trialled this particular tool, and we all know we came out quite well in this particular test, so we'll all behave in the same way again. Or, and this not just in RCTs, but in qualitative research as well, is experimenter expectations. In this particular example is, if you know you're being watched with your hand washing, you are going to change your behaviour, and you want the researcher to think that you're behaving in an appropriate manner. So you're not going to deliberately wash your hands badly, you are going to deliberately wash your hands well. A lot of the time when you're interviewing people in a qualitative research study, you have to be wary of the fact that your respondent might tell you what they think you want to hear, and that's always something that you need to think about. But in RCTs particularly, they talk about experimenter expectations. So if I'm looking for a positive change, if I'm looking for it, I'm going to find it. And is that potentially flawed? We talk about placebo groups as well, where we give a group of people an inert substance that looks exactly the same as the treatment. So placebo is commonly used in drug trials. And we might have blind placebos or double-blind placebos. So blind is when the people don't know whether they're getting a placebo or not. They're getting the same little white tablet as everybody else. They don't know what it is. And double-blind is when the researcher doesn't know either. So it's giving out white tablets, it's monitoring the results, and then after it's got the results back, the researcher will find out who was getting what drug. And I'm sure you can think through in your head what might be some of the pros and cons to all of these aspects of, sort of blind or double blind principles. In both qualitative research and quantitative research, we talk about sampling and selection. When you're looking at your research studies, think very carefully about how sampling was undertaken. We can never sample the whole population. If you want to do a study on again, student nurses, you can't speak to every student nurse in the world. It's impractical and it's unnecessary. So we tend to use, in quantitative research methodologies and positivist research, we tend to use random sampling. We might use random stratified sampling, or we might use simple randomized sampling. Has anybody else lost their sound? Okay. As I said before, it's being recorded, so if you missed that last bit, I'm sure you can pick it up on the recording. So we can use a randomized sampling procedure. When we're sampling, we have to think about inclusion criteria, exclusion criteria, to ensure that our sample is representative of the population that we're looking at. So if you want to look at people who suffer from indigestion, that's too big. You might want to look at men who suffer from indigestion between the ages of 25 and 40. So we've narrowed the inclusion and exclusion criteria. And when you're looking at your research studies, have a look at how they sampled, how they selected the people that they were going to include in their study, or how those people were selected for them. So stratified randomized sampling would be a clear version of quantitative positivist sampling. Whereas in qualitative research, we tend to use non-probability sampling because we are trying to, the emphasis here is on insight and understanding. So we can use convenience sampling. So it's the idea of easy to recruit and proximity. We might use purposive sampling. So that's the deliberate, non-random selection of people because of a specific characteristic. If I want to find out about childbearing women, I'm going to ask childbearing women. If I want to find out about smokers, I ask smokers. So I'm picking these people on purpose because of the theoretical knowledge that they have. Or I might use theoretical sampling, where I'm looking for a group of people who know something specific. So I want to find out about cardiac nurses, I will ask cardiac nurses. I will ask students, for example, or I would select. Disadvantages here is it's non-generalizable, and there is an element, and that element can be quite strong, of researcher bias. So I'm going to pick the people I want to talk to. In randomized control trials, often we use an element of convenience sampling though, because if you want to do a study on people who have a particular condition in your intensive care unit, you are going to select them as they come through your intensive care unit. So there is an element of convenience here, which does slightly nullify any kind of idea of stratified randomized sampling. So I often, in many pieces of research that you read out there, you'll see this integration of qualitative and quantitative designs that they've audited, they've tested, they've evaluated an intervention, and then they followed that up with an in-depth insight into seeking and understanding. So they've used both methodological principles to get a really holistic picture of something. We talk about this, and we refer to this as post-positivist thinking. We talk about the critical realist perspective. I would argue, though, that the original aim and the original objectives for a research study tend to come from one camp or the other. We then might utilise qualitative and quantitative designs to help us answer that original question. So as I said there, we might use qualitative data collection methods in quantitative research, such as some in-depth interviews or some focus groups or some case study analysis. And often you will see additional data collection done, maybe a focus group or something, to really substantiate what was found in the original intervention evaluation. So it's that sort of triangulation, so that's multiple points of data collection brought together to get a holistic picture of what the problem is, or what the issue is, or what the inquiry was about. It certainly gives us an increased validity, but it does support the idea that multiple realities can be trapped, which does tend to lean itself towards a more humanistic view of research. So, any questions? I've been talking for nearly 2.5 hours, so I'm sure there's lots to think about here. Any questions at all? Okay, so I'm getting a wave of either headaches or brains hurting, and a lot to take in, overwhelming. Okay, so yes, it is. I don't disagree. There's a lot to think about, and as an introduction and as a first session, there's quite a lot of sort of settling in a way. You've got to sort of go away now, I think, and think about some of the things that we've talked about this afternoon. Maybe revisit some of this on the webinar, and as I've said before, the recording will be uploaded in the next half an hour, so you can very easily go back and revisit some of it. I will put, as asked for earlier, I will put a forum up. So if you want to do any, you can engage in the forum. Please do. It would be really nice to see some conversations going on. I will have a look at any forum questions if you want to post them up, and then I can post the answers collectively. Alternatively, very happy for you to email me, and hopefully all of you have got my email address, so you can send me a question via email. If there's a question that's coming over and over again, what I might do is do one answer to everybody. I won't identify who asked the question, but I might send an email to all of you saying this question has been asked a number of times and here's the answer. So if there's a common email question, I might send it back to all of you. As I said before, all communication is done through the DLE and through your university emails. So you might send me an email on Yahoo or Hotmail or Google Mail or nhs.net. I might reply to you on your university email simply because of firewalls and all sorts of other things, and so I prefer that to be our method of communication. A number of you have articulated that terminology is complicated, and yes, I do completely agree. Terminology can be complicated, and all of the textbooks, pretty much all of them, so Parahu certainly, Cormack, Pollitt and Beck, Pollitt and Hungler, all of those key research texts that are on your Talis Aspire reading list have a glossary of terms in the back. And so that can often be really helpful because you can just keep revisiting what the different terms mean. There's a book that I mention as a sort of precursor, but pre-reading, which is by Moule & Heck. They have a glossary of terms, and they have they're very easy to read. And if you're coming back to this after a big break and you're not feeling very confident about it, Moule & Heck is a great place to start. I wouldn't necessarily say any book is level 6 or level 7. Moule & Heck is quite basic. It's something I recommend to the undergraduates. Parahu is slightly more complex, and it deals with slightly more in-depth concepts and theoretical perspectives. So yes, I would say it's more akin to a level 7 book. And then when we get into the finer points, there are textbooks on qualitative research methodology, there are research textbooks on quantitative research, and they are far more specialised, and I've cited some of those in the Thales Aspire list as well. How can you identify what the research methodology is? Well, in the Primo search, when you come across an article, wouldn't it be lovely if every article, if it was published in a journal, said this is a quantitative research study, this is a phenomenological piece of work? It doesn't, I'm sorry. I wish they did, but they don't. So sometimes you need to unpick what it is, what methodological approach it's taken, what the research studies, ontology and epistemology is. If it is a randomized control trial, for example, they tend to identify themselves. They tend to say this randomized control trial was undertaken. And so in the study design section of the article, or even in the abstract, they often mention their design, their study design. So you often get a clue in the abstract or the study design section. So hopefully that addresses that question. Unfortunately, a lot of the research textbooks I'm citing are not available as e-textbooks. So that's problematic. I have sent the Thales Aspire list to the librarian. Again, she is going to check to see if there are any online versions of any of the texts available. But one of the things to remember is that as a Plymouth University student, you can borrow books, they can be posted to you for free, they can be posted back for free. Equally, as a Plymouth University student, if you want a section of a book downloaded, that's an available option. Equally, as a university student, we have a reciprocal arrangement with almost all UK universities, so that you can borrow books on your Plymouth ID, and certainly you can use their libraries. So if it's NHS, obviously in your different trusts you might have access to a library. If you want to go to the local university library, then please email me and I can be very much more specific. In terms of which libraries to use, but there are options. Rona mentioned about newer editions of books. Parahu and Moule & Heck are both really, really cheap books to buy, the older editions on Amazon. If you are then wanting to cite them in your text, then it might be worth looking or certainly reviewing the newer version. But the older versions, if you just want them for reference, then they are just as good. certainly Mool and Heck, I think it was on the older version, the 2011 version is on sale on Amazon for like £6.99, whereas the new version is about 40 quid. So if you want it as just a basic text to just remind you of certain concepts, then it might, and you want to buy something, then I'm perfectly happy for you to look at an older edition. Any other questions? One of the slightly unfortunate issues regarding webinars is that it will cut off at 4 o'clock exactly, whether I'm mid-sentence or not, because that's when the license finishes. So I don't want to get to 4 o'clock and be midpoint in a response. So any other questions at this point? Because we've got about 15 minutes left, 20 minutes left. If you haven't got, sorry, does that mean you do not have access to the module page, this module page, with the animals on it? Hopefully all of you do. Is there anybody viewing now that doesn't have access to this module page? You might have access to another one as well. If you were enrolled on another one before, it doesn't disappear, but as long as you've got access to this. Anything under the general section. So none of this area comes up. Okay, so if you don't, and it's because your enrolment was late or you've been moved across from another module recently, and you've already addressed that with PDU, then the professional development unit, then great, don't worry. Yeah, so some of you were late enrolments or late changes. But sorry, Emma, can you give me a ring on my office number when the webinar finishes? Okay, great. Right, so everybody else has access, everybody else has this information and they can see everything. And I will, as I said, I will upload the recording as soon as we've finished. It takes about 10-15 minutes to do. Okay, well, if there's no other questions and there's no other comments, then thank you very much for your attention. As I said, I'll add the forum to the front page and I will upload the presentation, and I will look forward to seeing you all virtually on the 10th of October. Any questions, any queries, any issues between then and now, then don't hesitate to contact me via email. Okay, and thank you very much. Bye.